I briefly mentioned on Friday that overall growth follows an S pattern. Right, so the x-axis is time, the y-axis is growth. Okay. So, first year and into the second year, we see a very rapid growth spurt. All right. Slightly slower than it was in the womb. Okay. But still very, very rapid. So, from an observation point of view, what you can actually see, this is going to be the fastest point in growth for this child. Okay? Then, somewhere around 4 to 6, okay, this is going to not flatline because we're looking at growth. They continue growing, but they grow more steadily. All right? So they grow about the same amount every year until we hit puberty. And then we hit puberty and we see another big growth spurt. And then we see stable, right, and stop growing at some point in our early adulthood. All right. So this second growth spurt is puberty. The timing of that second growth spurt is highly individual, and it also differs between the sexes. So our overall growth pattern is what we were talking about, a universal pattern for humans. Right? All typically developing humans have these two big growth spurts. What's typical? Right? So this helps me understand what is typical. But the timing, particularly of the start of the second curve, but even the finish of the first one, right? So actually this should be 2, and this is 3 to puberty. So that's very specific to the individual, right? And it's increasingly variable with age. So the more we understand what a typical growth curve looks like, the better able we are to set realistic goals, or help people set realistic and effective goal setting. Okay? So this timing is different. For girls, it's going to be anywhere from 10 to typically 14, but it can be as late as 15. Okay? For boys, it's going to be 11 or 12 to around 18, 19. Okay? All right, so this type of curve is called a distance curve. Okay? Now, if this curve is representing height, okay, then on average girls start 9, 10-ish. And we start to see a growth spurt in their height. Their peak height velocity, so the point in time when they are growing the fastest, is somewhere around 11.5 to 12. So 2 to 3 years after they started. So they're going to be growing quite quickly for a couple of years. And then it's going to get quicker, and then it's going to start to slow down again. Growth in height for girls tapers off around 14. They should be done on average around 60. We all know people who grew taller after they were 60. Right? We're looking at an average. Okay. For boys, their peak height velocity occurs 13.5 to 14, so quite a bit after the girls. The boys are going to be growing their fastest. And their height tapers off around 17, 18. My younger brother was still growing when he finished his undergrad at 21. So I think he continued to grow for another year. Okay? So, as I said, this is an average picture, not a specific person. Okay? The fact that boys get a much longer growth spurt is one of the variables that plays a role in guys being taller than girls. It's not that girls grow differently or guys grow differently, it's that they grow for longer. Okay? So as I said, the S-curve is a distance curve. Right? If we look at this information on a velocity curve, it looks a little bit different, but it's saying basically the same thing. All right? Here's my peak height velocity. So this time I have age, or time along the bottom, and I've got height gain, changing growth on the y-axis rather than just pure growth. So, when we look at a velocity curve, obviously, we're not getting smaller as we get older, right? It's just that we start to slow down, we're plodding along, and here's our growth spurt. Okay, one for girls, one for boys. Once we hit our peak height velocity, any peak on a velocity curve indicates a change in direction. Right? So I'm growing really fast. Here's my fastest. Now I'm slowing down. I'm still growing, but I'm growing more slowly. Right? So this one tells us the extent of the growth, and this version tells us the rate of growth. So it's just different ways of presenting the data. This way it's much easier to see at what age they hit their peak height velocity. On here, you can't really tell that unless you get a very distinct change in the slope. Right? But since they're still growing quite fast until the end of puberty, you might not get a very clear change in the slope on the distance curve. Then once we reach adulthood, once we finish growing, so again, the point at which this plateaus is going to be different for different individuals. But at some point, we plateau until we're in our mid-40s, early 50s, and then we start to shrink a little bit, but slowly. Now, if instead of looking at height, we look at weight, we start off with the same overall picture, all right? Our weight curve is also S-shaped. but it's much more susceptible to, bless you, to extrinsic factors. Does the person exercise? What kind of nutrition do they have? How much muscle do they have? Have they been sick? Right? Do they have have they had a disease and been unwell for a period of months? Okay. What we see when we're looking at teenagers is that they grow up and then they fill out. Right? So their peak weight velocity follows their peak height velocity by a number of months, depending on whether it's a boy or a girl. Limb segments can continue to grow and reach their peak growth before or after the height. So some people will grow tall very quickly, and then their legs and arms get longer. Right? Other people start to get longer arms and legs, and then all of a sudden you see a big shoot because their torso, their spine extends. Right? Either way, right, the finish of that skeletal growth occurs before we see the peak weight velocity. Right? The peak skeletal velocity is always before the peak weight. So, our young children put on weight rapidly. They have a growth spurt for their weight as well as their height. Then we see this plodding. They put on about the same weight every year for several years, if they're healthy. Some of you that were at the CDC with me this morning know why I say if they're healthy, because we had several rather large children this morning, which is a little disappointing. Okay? The one kid, he was what, 35 kilos?
Yeah,
So he's 4 or 5 and he's over 70 pounds.
it's like
And yes, he's quite tall. Very wide. So that's going to be challenging on the playground. All right, then we get to our puberty. First thing we see in puberty, particularly for boys, is a very sharp increase in height, and then we start to see an increase in weight. Okay? That causes a problem. What kind of constraint are we talking about when we're looking at growth? Structural, very good, thank you. Good one. Right? A structural constraint. So, when we're looking at this puberty region, we've got a very rapidly changing constraint over a period of years. It has a dramatic effect on motor patterns. Okay? You might have kids who are quite competent at a particular skill, and then all of a sudden they shoot up or shoot out, and now the skill doesn't work anymore. Right? It can be very frustrating for you as a teacher and for them. Right? They can catch a ball, no problem. All of a sudden their arms are 3 inches longer and their hands are 3 inches further away, and now they can't catch the ball. Because their brain has to relearn where the hand is. The arm now weighs more, so until they're strong enough, they can't move their arm as quickly as they could before. Weight follows skeleton, right? So the arm grows, and then we get muscle mass. So initially, this arm is now way heavy, right? So all kinds of weird stuff happens to motor skills during puberty. Particularly for boys, because their growth spurt is so much more rapid. So I want you to look at page 66 in your book. Oh wait, have I got these graphs back to front? I'm going to look here. No. I'm missing one. Look at page 66. Okay. Gives you a very nice visual of the change in body proportion due to relative growth. Right? So if you look at the infant, the baby, you see its head is very, very large in proportion to its body. Okay? And as we grow, the head proportionally gets smaller to the body. Okay? At birth, the head is about 1/4 of your body length. When you're an adult, your head is only about 1/8 of your body length. So that also impacts what we see from a motor skill perspective. Because when they're little, they've got this big, top-heavy head, right? And they've got itty-bitty little feet, right? So their base of support, go back to our base of support, right, is very small, but this head can tip them off balance very quickly. So we see them tip and fall a lot. Right? Because they're top heavy. As we grow more, now our feet get bigger, we get stronger, and our head is proportionally getting smaller. Now for you guys, you'd have to have an inner ear infection or something pretty dramatic to tip over just standing or walking. Make sense? Okay. So what other growth spurts do we see? We don't just see height. It's the one that we notice maybe because it's the first, normally, the first one to happen, but it's not the only one. So then we start to see differences depending on whether we're looking at a male or a female. Right? For the boys during puberty, after the increase in peak height velocity, they start, so once they've had their peak height velocity, they're all tall and lanky. Now all of a sudden their shoulders start expanding. All right? So we see what we call a biachromial growth spurt. Right? The acromion process is that knobbly bit on the side of your shoulders. We start to see an increase in width. Collarbone lengthens. Right? And we start to get the beginning of that triangle shape. Once we've seen height and shoulders, then we start to see muscle mass. Right? So there's going to be a period of time where boys are relatively clumsy. Right? They go to pick up a cup. How many of the girls have brothers? Almost all of you. And how many of the boys remember, right? Going through puberty, you go to get a cup of water or something and you just knock it over. Because your arm's longer than it was. So you have to judge the distance differently. There's a learning curve there, right? For females, slightly different. They don't undergo the biachromial spurt, they undergo a biiliac spurt. So the iliac crest is the top of the back of the hip there. You start to see widening of the hips. Okay. And that gives girls that slightly more hourglass shape typically. So now we've got, once we're in puberty, coming out the other side of puberty, now we have real physical differences for the first time between boys and girls. So this is the point in time where it starts to get a little more tricky playing co-ed type games. Right? You've got to be creative with the rules, otherwise the girls can't keep up if it's a throwing game. If it's a running game, girls do just fine. Right? But if it's an upper body activity, boys are now going to outperform the girls, just biomechanically. Right? Doesn't matter even if their throwing technique is rubbish. They'll throw the ball further because they've got longer arms, they're taller, and they've got more muscle. Right? So it starts to get a little more complicated in PE and sports and rec once we're through that peak growth curve. Okay? Also, we've got to look at the fact that because of the biiliac expansion in the females, we now have a much stronger, what we call Q angle into the knee. Okay? Because the head of the femur has moved out here, the angle of the femur coming into the knee joint is much more dramatic. So that's quite interesting, because if you look at really, really good female distance runners, like world-class distance runners, they are not hourglass. Right? World-class female distance runners are women who genetically have relatively narrow hips. So their Q angle is a little less extreme. That allows them to put in the mileage to train to be world class. The Q angle is one of the reasons, there are several reasons, and there's a lot of research into knee injuries in female athletes, particularly basketball players, soccer players. They get a lot of knee injuries, right? The girls. One of the reasons they get more knee injuries than male basketball players and male soccer players is Q angle. It's not the only reason, but it is one of the reasons. Right? So we've got to keep thinking about our constraints triangle. In early childhood, children are very top heavy. That raises their center of gravity. Remember, if we want to stay balanced, we want to lower our center of gravity. Right? So they're at a disadvantage to maintain their balance. As we grow, we've got these structural constraints that are undergoing a lot of change. That means all the time your brain has to keep relearning skills because the constraint changed. And as it relearns the skill, we see a different movement pattern emerge because of the new structural constraint. Right? Can be very, very frustrating. And over the next few chapters, we'll be looking at growth and development in other systems because they don't all grow and develop at the same rate. Okay? Each system has its own unique timeline. And so they all interact in different ways to the movement pattern that you're seeing. Question? Okay on this? Yes. All right. So we said we were going to look at growth and then maturation. So let's have a quick look at maturation. So in chapter 1, maturation was defined as a qualitative change in a system. Right? So now we're not looking at a change in the size of a tissue, we're looking at a change in the function of the tissue. And when we look at physiological maturation, girls are always ahead of the boys. Right? There is scientific truth to the fact that girls are more mature than boys. And girls, it never changes, so get used to it. Okay? So, children and youth become older, they grow in size, as we've looked at, and they start to mature. Those two things are related, but they don't proceed at the same rate. Right? Maturation rate is going to vary very distinctly between individuals. So a child may be very small in size, but relatively mature for their chronological age. You can't make an assumption because you can't see maturity. Right? You don't have the equipment to test whether or not a system is physiologically mature. So you can't assume, particularly if you're going to work with this age group, right? You can't assume that the tallest person in the class is also the most physiologically mature, because that might not be the case. Age alone doesn't tell me who's the most mature in the class. Size doesn't tell me who's the most physiologically mature. Okay? Some systems can become more mature without growing bigger. Right? We're looking at the function of the system, not the size of the system. Right? And every system varies. We also have early maturers and late maturers. Right? So if I have a young girl who doesn't start menstruating until she's 15 or 16, then she is physiologically a late maturer for that system, right? For her reproductive system. You might have a young lady who starts menstruating at 10 and a half or 11. She's physiologically an early maturer for that system. Okay? So, secondary sex characteristics appear as a function of maturation. Girls mature more early than boys do, so we start to see breast development in young girls before we start to see any big changes for the boys, right? And they appear at a younger age in early maturers. So if my boy is an early maturer, he's going to show secondary sex characteristics before a boy who's a late maturer. Okay. So when we look at girls, if we use our velocity curve, then we can make a relatively good estimate as to when that girl is going to start menstruating. Typically, it follows her peak height velocity by about a year. So if you're measuring her regularly as the teacher or the parent, right, and you know, okay, she peaked out here, now she's still growing because I'm still having to buy her new clothes, but it's slowing down. About a year from when she peaked out is when she's going to start menstruating, on average. We don't have a similar timing mechanism for the boys, right? So viable sperm, because menstruating means she's got viable eggs and she's sexually mature, right? Viable sperm in the boys is a gradual process. It doesn't occur a year after peak height velocity, it's just gradual. So it's much harder to know when your son is sexually mature versus your daughter. So maturation is also a structural constraint. The more mature the individual is, the more likely they are to be stronger than someone who is less mature in the muscular system. They are likely to be more coordinated because their nervous system is likely to be more mature, even though everything's maturing at different rates. So if they're stronger and they're more coordinated, chances are they're going to be pretty good at PE and sport versus everybody in their class, right? So we get a bit of a problem because parents get a little carried away if little Johnny is the star, right, on the school team because he's an early maturer. So he's taller than the rest of the boys, he's stronger than the rest of the boys, and so that makes him good at whatever games they're doing or whatever sport they're doing at the school, okay? Mum and Dad get nice and excited because they see dollar signs. I won't have to pay for him to go to college, I won't have, right? The problem is, though, remember he's an early maturer. So in 2 years' time, is he still the tallest person in the class and the strongest person in the class? Maybe not, because the other boys will have started to mature as well. And they may be genetically bigger than Johnny. Right? Johnny just started early, so that gave him an advantage. Now, some of that advantage plays a role because he gets more practice because he's better. Does that make sense? Right? So he's more able to throw, he's more able to run, he's more able to be skilled in sport. So he gets an additional amount of time to practice those skills until everybody else catches up. So that extra practice never goes away. It's just that he might not end up being the biggest kid in the class. And so now his role within the game might have to change. And he may not even be the best in the class anymore. So when you're teaching this age group, whether you're coaching them in a city team, whether you're working with them at the rec center, whether you become a PE teacher and you're working with them at school, or you're a coach in middle school, right? It's important to kind of tamp down the parents' enthusiasm a little bit. Okay? How many kids keep playing because mum and dad tell them they have to keep playing, not because they want to keep playing? Right? Mum and dad have to take a back seat. It's got to be up to the individual. Mum and dad can be supportive without being pushy. Right? There's a difference. So our extrinsic influences, we looked at teratogens with regards to the prenatal. Okay? Our extrinsic influences increase after birth. Okay? Our children are particularly sensitive or susceptible during those fast growth periods. If for some reason they are held back in their growth and maturation, so if they are injured or if they are sick and they spend a long time in bed, months in bed, then we have a concept called catch-up growth. So they're behind where they should be for their age and size. they're small. When their environment is re-established as positive, right? They become healthy, they're eating properly, okay? They're moving around, they're not tied to a bed anymore. Then we see catch-up growth. Typically, catch-up growth for most kids, if the environment is very positive, will get them back to their potential. It'll get them back on track. But not always. Sometimes they never match their potential if they've been delayed for some reason. So, what extrinsic factor might affect growth during infancy? What they eat, right? Nutrition is the big one. Okay? Do they have adequate, good nutrition? Okay? Or are they underserved and their nutrition levels are low? Okay. During adolescence, probably nutrition is going to play a role, but maybe illness would play a bigger role in holding them back. It's unlikely, particularly in our kind of country, that a teenager is not going to be eating. Might not be eating great food, but he's going to be eating, yes, Craig.
Would sleep be an extrinsic factor, or not really?
I think yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially for the teenager. So, what about adults then? What do we see happen for adults? Okay, we said earlier, height's pretty stable until your mid-late 40s, early 50s. Okay, start to get compression of the cartilage pads in the spine and in the legs. So often you'll see people are taller first thing in the morning. So when, as your parents get older, you can watch for this one. This one's really starting to be quite amusing to me. You get in the car in the morning and you have to adjust the mirror, right? And then you get in the car at night when you've been standing all day and you have to adjust the mirror again because now you're not as tall as you were first thing in the morning, right? Some older adults will develop osteoporosis, so their spine, and they might have like bad posture when you're young, develops into really bad posture as you get older. That's why everybody should take dance class, because everybody should learn to stand up straight. Right? Because especially when you're tall, tall people tend to do this. Particular girls, because being a really tall girl is a little bit embarrassing, unless you're a great athlete, but in the normal population, okay? And you'll see this. Well, this becomes this as you hit your 70s and your 80s. We see a decrease. We don't see any change in the length of the legs and the arms, but the trunk length starts to decrease a little bit. When we look at weight, right, technically, weight should flatline here as well, right? You finish growing. Unless you're going to exercise and put on muscle mass, then weight should flatline. Well, we all know that's not what happens, right? Weight goes, okay? So the average adult, not you, because you guys are not average in any sense of the word, right? You are so far off average, it's laughable, okay? The average adult starts to gain weight in their 20s. And this weight gain is due to lifestyle, not genetics. Genetically, they're done with their growth curve. This is lifestyle now. This is, I've got to go out and get a job. And my job is sitting in an office all day, putting numbers into a computer. Right? So unless I balance that with a decrease in the amount of food that I'm eating, we get weight gain. So I have to counteract that sedentary work, sedentary job, by adding some extra activity somewhere else. Well, that gets harder and harder as you get older. Okay? You've got to commute. You've got kids to wake up and get dressed and get to school. Right? You've got shopping and housework to do. Okay? Particularly when we look at middle-aged and older adults, we also start to see a loss of muscle mass. But that again is related to their lifestyle, because we don't see a decrease, a physiological decrease in muscle mass until you hit your 70s. Right? So the loss of muscle mass for someone in their 40s is because they're not exercising, they're not being active. Right? Well, how do I maintain balance? What do I need? What did we say we needed to maintain balance? Stability. How do I get stability? Strength. Right? So, if I'm losing muscle mass, I'm losing strength. Now I'm more likely to have an accident. All kinds of implications that occur when people don't maintain a healthy, active lifestyle as they get older. Okay? So the older we get, the more these extrinsic factors start to play a role. Have to become super disciplined as you get older to try to maintain an activity program. Or teach HPE, because then it's relatively easy, right? Because I'm jumping all day. So, in this country, in the West generally, we are an aging population. And we do not have anywhere near enough research on this population. So, the estimate is that by 2030, at least a quarter of the adult population in the US will be 65 or older. So retirement age. We've got lots of research on teenagers. We have lots of research on people your age. We've got quite a lot of research on children 7, 8, 9. We're developing more research on our little people. Our elderly population, we're really lacking, and there are luckily some researchers now who are really getting into this population and looking at what is typical. What is typical for someone who's 78? Right? We don't know. Okay. What is someone who's 78 capable of? Okay. So my mum was a smoker, overweight, pretty sedentary. She had lots of other health issues, some of which were because she was a smoker, overweight, and sedentary. Right? She actually lived until she was 78, so she did quite well given her lifestyle, to be quite honest. My dad is 82. He goes to the gym at least 3 times a week. Right? He lifts, he swims, he rides the bike. Okay? He eats very healthily. He's still out there pushing the lawnmower, doing the shopping every day. Totally different quality of life to what my mum had, who couldn't leave the house without help. Right? She couldn't go shopping on her own. My sister had to go with her because she wasn't able to pick the shopping up and put it in the car. Totally different quality of life. What's inevitable? What is typical? We don't know. Right? Is this typical? I hope so. He's a little thin. I probably will eat too much ice cream to be quite that lean by that age. But this chap has to be in his early, mid-70s. Right? That's what my dad looks like. So we know for sure that people who maintain physical activity across their lifespan are able to delay the amount of decline that we see. Do we see a decline? Of course. Can my dad walk as fast as he could 10 years ago? No. Can he lift as much as he could 10 years ago? No. But he still goes to the gym and lifts. That's really impressive at 82, right? So it's not that you can stop the decline. You can't stop it, right? We all have a timeline. Human cells do not, unfortunately, last forever, right? They grow, they mature, they decline. That's it. So I can't stop them declining. I can slow it down, though, so that the decline is not as fast or maybe as deep. And that allows me to maintain a quality of life that maybe other people can't have if they've been sedentary. Right? What we've noticed is that even people who have been sedentary and are pretty frail, aren't very strong, can improve if they're given an adequate program. An appropriate, developmentally appropriate program. So right now, Dr. Berkey and I, mainly Dr. Berkey, I'm kind of jumping in on the back there, but we went and did a training program this summer. It's a balanced training for people 65 and older. And we just started running it 2 weeks ago at the Senior Citizen Centre. So it's going to be fascinating, especially because this is not my age group, right? The little people, this is way outside what I know. Fascinating to see how much impact does doing this training twice a week for 4 months have on this group of people. The research would say it should help them, but how much? I don't know. Okay. Let me have a look here. All right, we have one more chapter, and then we have the first exam. My recommendation is that you start reviewing the material we've already covered. Don't leave it all until the day before the exam. Start now.